Right, so we'll begin respiratory physiology by looking at ventilation first. So ventilation is the mechanical process by which we move air in and out of our lungs. With respiration, this is divided into three different functions. The first is ventilation, and again, this is the mechanical process that moves air into and out of our lungs. It has to do with contraction of different thoracic and abdominal muscles as well. The second function is gas exchange, and this occurs between the air and the capillaries in the lungs, and then between the systemic capillaries and tissues of the body. So oxygen concentration is higher in the lungs than in the blood, so oxygen diffuses into the blood, whereas carbon dioxide concentration in the blood is higher than in the lungs, so carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood. And so both are going to move down their concentration gradients with the principle of diffusion. And then the third function is with oxygen utilization, and this is due to cellular respiration where tissues make ATP, and so this process is going to be utilized by our tissues and is with internal respiration. With ventilation, again, this is the mechanical process that moves air in and out of our lungs, and it has to do a lot with changes in lung volume as well as with the use of our thoracic and abdominal muscles. So oxygen concentration is going to be greatest in the air, and then so what we have is that the lungs also have a higher concentration of oxygen as compared to our blood, so then oxygen is going to diffuse from the air into the blood via the lungs. Carbon dioxide, though, is going to move from the blood into the air by diffusion down its concentration gradient. And so gas exchange is going to occur entirely by the principles of diffusion, again, going from higher to lower pressure. And this is also a very quick process because the lungs have a large surface area and also a very small diffusion distance within the alveoli. So the primary site of gas exchange occurs within the alveoli. And alveoli are going to be polyhedral in shape and be clustered like units that resemble a honeycomb. We have over 300 million air sacs, which the air sacs are the actual alveoli. And these have a large surface area of about 60 to 80 meters squared, or 760 square feet. So each alveolus is only one cell layer thick, allowing for that rapid diffusion to occur between oxygen and carbon dioxide. And so at any moment in time, a molecule only has to cross a barrier that is 2 cell layers thick. So the site of gas exchange is going to occur within the alveolar type 1 cells. And so what I'll do here is outline. Here we have our alveolar type 1, and you can see it has a very thin membrane. And we have 95 to 97% total surface area within the lungs that are made up of alveoli type 1 cells. And again, this is the primary area where gas exchange occurs. Then we also have alveolar type 2 cells, and so here I'll circle them. And these are fewer in number, however, they have a very important function because they secrete surfactant. And so with surfactant, this also helps to reabsorb sodium and water and to help prevent fluid buildup within the lungs. The respiratory zone is going to be where gas exchange occurs, and so the alveoli will be involved here. With the gas exchange, this will be between the air and the blood, and this includes the respiratory bronchioles and alveolar sacs. So here we're looking at this area right here, and so the respiratory bronchioles are going to be the terminal ends of the bronchioles, or they stem from the terminal bronchioles and then will empty into these alveoli clusters. So the respiratory bronchioles, again, will be where the clusters of alveolar are, and so these are going to be very thin air tubes. And in order for gas exchange to occur, thus we need to have several different alveoli. The conducting zone, on the other hand, are all the other structures where air will pass from the air and from our nasal cavity, and then before they reach into the respiratory zone. And so this includes the nasal cavity, includes the pharynx, includes the larynx here, and then we'll travel down into the trachea, where then this will branch into the left and the right primary bronchi. And then from there, we'll go into the secondary, tertiary, have about 20 more generations before we get to those terminal bronchioles. And so the purpose of the conducting zone is to warm the air and to humidify it. And this is regardless of what temperature is outside, the temperature that reaches the respiratory zone will be that of 37 degrees Celsius. And so also we'll have humidification, where air will also be saturated with water vapors. And then also we have filtering and cleaning as a function of the conducting zone, where mucus will trap particles in inspired air, and usually large particles will be filtered and will not reach our lungs, and the mucus moves down by cilia and then to be expectorated, or another word for swallowed. So problems that can occur, though, is if large particles do make it down into the lungs and penetrate the alveoli. And so this is where we have a condition like black lung, where coal dust can cause scarring of those lungs, and so will inhibit the ability of the mechanical ventilation. So with our lungs, we have to do a little bit of anatomy recall, and we have two different pleuras that are associated. And so the first one is going to be the visceral pleura. And so the visceral pleura is going to be the serous membrane covering that covers each surface of the lung. The parietal pleura is going to be the outer membrane that's attached to the inner surface of the thoracic cavity. And so the two of these are stuck together like two wet pieces of glass. And so there's this potential space that we have, and that's the intrapleural space between the visceral and the parietal pleura. And here we have a thin film of fluid that is secreted by the membranes, and this is predominantly to help lubricate the lungs as we have constant contraction and relaxation of those lungs. And so the lungs normally remain in contact with the chest wall, and then will expand and contract along within the thoracic cavity. So again, that lubrication helps with those frictional forces. And so we have two different pressures that are created within these pleura. So the first one is the intrapulmonary pressure, also known as the intraalveolar pressure. And so this is the pressure within the alveoli, commonly known as pressure within the lungs. The intrapleural pressure, this is going to be the pressure that's found within that intrapleural space. And so this pressure is considered to be negative because it's a pressure below the atmosphere. And this is found between the visceral and the parietal pleura. And so pressure differences then are going to be caused by changes in lung volume that we see. The transpulmonary pressure will be the pressure differences between the two of the intrapulmonary or lung pressure and the intrapleural pressure, which is between those two pleuras. The intrapulmonary pressure is going to be greater than the intrapleural pressure, and this is what's going to keep the lungs against that chest wall. And so a positive pressure is going to be created during inhalation, and exhalation is going to cause lung volume changes. And during inspiration, what we have is that the atmospheric pressure is going to be greater than the intrapulmonary, or again, the lung pressure, which will remain at -3 millimeters of mercury. And so with inhalation, that means that the intrapulmonary pressure is lower than the atmospheric pressure. And so this is termed a negative pressure. With expiration, we have the intrapulmonary pressure, the lung pressure, is going to be positive at 3 millimeters of mercury, and so it's going to be greater than atmospheric pressure. With the intrapleural pressures, what we see is the same trend where during inspiration, we will have a more negative pressure as compared to expiration within the intrapleural pressure, where this will be a little bit more positive. So this brings us to Boyle's Law, where this is the changes in intrapulmonary pressure that occur resulting due to changes in lung volume. So the pressure of a gas will be inversely proportional to its volume, meaning as an increase in lung volume during inspiration, this will decrease the intrapulmonary pressure to subatmospheric levels, and so air will go in. Whereas a decrease in lung volume during expiration increases intrapulmonary pressure above atmospheric levels, and so air will go out. Some of the physical properties of the lungs with ventilation have to do with the changes in lung volume. And so 3 different things can affect the lung functions. We have compliance, elasticity, and surface tension, where compliance will be the stretching, elasticity will be the changes in the recoil ability, and surface tension will occur within the alveoli. So let's first look at compliance. And so this is how easily distendable or stretchable the lungs are. And so the changes in lung volume per change in transpulmonary pressure will have a ratio where the change in volume will be divided by the change in pressure. And so these can also be reduced by factors that produce a resistance to distension, like connective tissue buildup, with what we see with pulmonary fibrosis. And interestingly enough, the lungs are 100 times more dispensable than any toy balloon. And so compliance, again, will be reduced by certain factors, though, that we're exposed to. So with elasticity, this is the tendency to return to its initial size after distension. And because the lungs are stuck to the thoracic wall, they are always under elastic tension. They have a high content of elastin fibers, and that's what makes them very elastic and resistant to distension, and so they have a high recoil ability. So tension will increase during inspiration and will be reduced by elastic recoil during expiration. And the last variable to factor in with the lung function is surface tension. And so this is the force that's exerted by a fluid in the alveoli to resist distension. And so the lungs will secrete and absorb fluids and leave a very thin film. And so this is what causes that surface tension. The fluid that is absorbed is going to be driven by osmosis by active sodium transport, and fluid secretion will be driven by active transport of chloride into alveolar epithelial cells. And the water molecules also at the surface of the alveoli are attracted to other water molecules by attractive forces. So going back to our review of chemistry, this would be due to those van der Waals forces. And so the force is directed inward, and this helps to raise the pressure of the alveoli. And so this helps essentially to prevent the collapse of the alveoli. People with cystic fibrosis, though, they have a defect in the ability to balance the fluid absorption and secretion. And so they also have a less water content within the alveoli, and so it's harder to clear that gunk basically out of the lungs. So with surface tension, there is this law of Laplace that states that the pressure in the alveoli is directly proportional to the surface tension and inversely proportional to the radius of the alveoli. So here in this equation, so pressure is going to be 2 times the surface tension divided by the radius. So with this law, this would state that with a radius of a smaller alveoli, this would have a higher pressure as compared to the alveoli of a larger size, where here we have only one. And so if the pressure in the small alveolus was greater than in the larger, the surface tension would be the same. What this equates to then is that the smaller alveoli would be at greater risk of collapse without the surfactant. Surfactant, again, is going to be created by alveolar type 2 cells, and it's essentially a phospholipid. And the alveolar fluid then has the surfactant to decrease surface tension to combat that law of Laplace. So as the alveoli decrease with expiration, surfactant's ability has an increase in ability to decrease surface tension. These are predominantly due to attractive forces of hydrogen bonding that are between the water molecules and allows for that decrease in surface tension. One mechanism that our body has is that as the surfactant becomes more concentrated, as the alveoli get smaller during expiration. And so this helps them from collapsing on one another. And so there's some disorders that can occur when we have improper or imbalance of surfactant. So the first is respiratory distress syndrome, and we see this typically within fetuses where production of surfactant doesn't begin until late in fetal life. And so premature babies, which are under 34 weeks of gestation, have a high risk of alveolar collapse once they exit the womb. And so these, luckily, though, can be treated with surfactant and are usually pretty successful in survival rates. And then acute respiratory distress syndrome is a similar problem that we find with adults, and it's typically found associated with a septic shock, during which lung compliance and there's a reduced in surfactant. However, this is not treatable with just the addition of surfactant.